a potential victory in that when we eventually do the digital television transition, the FCC has sort of been making the decisions to let the space, that spectrum space that will get opened up, a lot of it become what they're calling white space or unused space, and it'll be unlicensed space, which means that an internet service provider could get started in a municipality or other place and use that space and not pay some exorbitant fee. So that's got another potential. But I mean, I agree that it shouldn't be.
If you're not renting it out, then you have to really be clear about how to share that white space. Because as soon as there's white space access, then there becomes a market in it. Yeah. And even the nonprofit sector can start being in competition for that space. So we need to think through the fair access for that space. And if you know who's doing that, I'd like to know at some point.
Great, thank you. I wanted to bring forward one kind of positive example of technology linked to advocacy and think about the policy implications of that. And then I wanted to just kind of bring forward a question regarding innovation and technology to our group as a whole. So the first is, one of the groups that we work with is an interfaith group that has been organizing in 22 states, Gamaliel Foundation. Bob knows them, maybe others here do too. And when they set about having an immigration march, one of the first really large marches in San Diego, there was a real concern because of the huge INS crackdowns that are going on in San Diego. And so people were terrified to really turn out for this protest. And they eventually succeeded in getting 50,000 people there, which was remarkable in San Diego, unprecedented. And the way that they did it was having a cascade of DJs announcing the information and also responding to concerns as it came up, so that if you turned from station to station, you would keep getting the same information, and they timed it and coordinated. And I thought it was a really lovely way of kind of innovation and technology, and it brings forward also the idea of ethnic media. You know, how do we, and various language-speaking groups that have created their own media and ways of communicating. So I loved this 50,000-person march that resulted from the DJs cascading their messages over the week before. The other thing I wanted to just bring up in general is how do we, when we think about the big picture of everything that we need to learn how to do for sustainable communities, you know, our whole bigger picture, when we think of from the technology to the food, education, reinvention of healthcare, restorative justice, all that, and the curriculum that needs to get redesigned so that our schools are actually teaching what we need to learn to be transformed and sustainable. Just raising the question of how do we really go to scale on sharing of information, and how do we really go to scale with how to get the word out. And I think it's a different issue than kind of what we've been talking about here, but how do we manage the flow of information, generativity, and new knowledge? And I was also thinking on just a kind of microcosm level, how do we share what we're generating here this weekend? And on a playful level, I wanted to share my little creation, which was, this is the Paloma broadcast from Praxis project, everything that we're learning about policy and innovation, going out to the stars and to the moon and being on open source. So anyway, that's just the reaching the whole earth.
You guys all had your other words. And so I'll just come straight around. Your turn, so I'll get yours tomorrow.
Well, mine was quite a while ago on another thread or link, going back to the genetic, right? How do you reconcile, we say, technology that's quote unquote used for good and that's used for bad. For example, the Innocence Project has very successfully used DNA testing to have persons exonerated. Yet we know that's been used for bad as well. And the African ancestry, I mean, I went in and got my little test, and I didn't even think of all the things you brought. I mean, it hadn't even really even crossed my mind what vulnerabilities I might have been even set up for myself, having my, what wasn't my blood, my, my relatives up there. So yeah, how do you balance that?
I don't have the answer. But I think that we need to I think part of what we need to do at this point is let people know that there's something to reconcile, right? I mean, I think the fact that you, who is quite savvy about these things, didn't even think about the potential vulnerability. I mean, there are plenty of people who aren't. I mean, I have interviewed, lots of working class folks for whom the $350 to get one test is quite expensive, and they get the family together at Christmas and they pass the hat and they test one elder, right? So, and these aren't necessarily people who are as savvy as any of, are not necessarily college educated, took a science class in college or these sorts of things. So, I don't know that they can be reconciled. I mean, technologies always have been both good and bad, right? I mean, they save our lives and they kick our ass, and it's always been the case historically. So, but I think partly I guess what I'm after right now with regard to the communities of color and these genetic testing is just awareness that these things are actually not, in our heads they're discrete, right? But the implications of them are totally overlapping, and the implications of that are still to be determined, I think.
I also kind of like missed my thread. Let me just, on the genetics thing, I think people of color have learned, and I'm going to speak specifically in terms of African American experience, have learned a long time ago that if an action, an entity, or procedure has implications for abuse, and we are subjects, then it's most likely will be abused.
It's the canary in the coal mine.
So yes, so I think anytime there's a potential for breaches in confidentiality or the potential for having negative impacts, whether no matter what the issues in the areas are, and if it's even for done for good, the dark side is that the potential for abuse, particularly when it comes to the issues in terms of race. The other point I was going to make is media and technology used to promote to promote propaganda, to be propaganda. Media as propaganda, and I'm not using propaganda in a pejorative sense, but I'm using propaganda as Webster, information being disseminated for the purpose of promoting a particular cause, and looking at the harm and the damage that media, popular media, movies, television, whatever, has done in promoting this image of fear of the black male. Now, understanding how institutional racism, cultural racism overlay, and looking at something that is rational and objective, and looking at racism, institutional and white racism as a mental illness, and as not rational and not objective. If anybody should be fearful and afraid, given the history of this country, in terms of people of color, in terms of Native American, indigenous people, in terms of African and black people, in terms of Hispanics, and you start naming all the harm and the damage that has been done, the violence that has been perpetrated. If anybody should be fearful when you walk down the streets or you walk to your car, it should be us.